It's my pleasure to introduce my guest today, the illustrious composer, pianist, music expert, Dr. Robert Greenberg. Dr. Greenberg has composed over 50 works for a wide variety of instrumental and vocal ensembles, and his works have been performed all over the world. A Steinway artist, Dr. Greenberg has also received many other honors, including 3 Nicola De Lorenzo Composition Prizes and a Koussevitzky Commission from the Library of Congress. He has been profiled in various major publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Inc. magazine, and the London Times. Dr. Greenberg is popularly known for his over 550 lectures recorded for the esteemed education company The Great Courses, including popular courses such as How to Listen to and Understand Great Music, How to Listen to and Understand Opera, Great Music of the 20th Century, and many other great ones. Dr. Greenberg, it's so great to have you on the show for the first time.
Thank you so much, Nikhil.
Well, you come from a musical family yourself. Your grandmother graduated from the New York Institute of Musical Art, which eventually became Juilliard.
8 years later, 8 years after she graduated. So she was very proud of that, and she lived in New York and got a lot of mileage out of it for the rest of her life.
Did she know, in New York City, wasn't that like a haven for classical musicians at the time?
Well, it's always been a haven for classical musicians, but particularly in the 4 or 5 years after she graduated. She graduated in 1916. And of course, the Russian Revolution began in 1917. And a tremendous number of so-called whites, those people associated with the lesser nobility or the aristocracy, had to leave, had to get out. Their lives were in danger. And a great number of them came to the United States. And so just like what happened, I'm talking here from San Francisco, just what happened in San Francisco in 1990, 91, when the Soviet Union disintegrated and we suddenly filled up with all of these extraordinary Russians who were desperate to get out. So that happened, I think, in New York in 1917, 18, 19. A tremendous number of Russian expats ended up in the United States, including her personal hero, Vladimir Horowitz. Heifetz came to the United States at that point. Milstein, another great violinist. Yeah, a whole generation came over. And of course, New York was always the capital of our country, whether we like it or not. So she knew a lot of people. She knew a composer named Howard Hanson, who turned out to be the president of the Eastman School for many decades. She studied with a pianist named Joseph Hofmann, who was a very, very famous Polish pianist.
Oh my gosh, these are...
Yeah, she, but those were the times. Those were the times. The pool was much smaller, and the general population pool.
Let me ask you, Dr. Greenberg, about Joseph Hofmann. Now, he was a small person, right? He had small hands. That didn't stop him?
It never stopped anybody at the piano. Have you ever seen Alicia de la Roca play? Alicia de la Roca is, as you might guess, a Spanish-born pianist. She died about 10 years ago, would be my guess, without referring to it. She could play anything. I heard her play the Emperor Concerto in concert. But her specialty, her amazing specialty, was Spanish music, including Iberia by Isaac Albéniz, which is one of the most difficult pieces to play on the planet. 12 character pieces, which are impossible. They're impossible. In fact, he was going to destroy, he said he got so depressed, he was going to destroy the manuscript because no one could play this. And he was a fine pianist himself. Well, she learned those pieces as a teenager. She said she used to learn one a day. And she was tiny, maybe 4'10", 4'11". They'd have to put wooden blocks on the pedals so her feet could reach the pedals. And she had these itsy-bitsy stunted little hands. And I'll tell you, her recording of the Albéniz is a miracle. Her recording of the Schumann Carnival, which is filled with tenths, it's a miracle. I don't know how she does it. She rolls her hands in different directions and so forth, but you can't hear her breaking the chords. So where there's a will, there's a way.
Right. Now, that's an astonishing background. What a pedigree that you have. You started very young as well, right?
Yeah, unfortunately. It was something that we were all in my family expected to do. My grandmother spent 50 years teaching the kids of Queens, New York, piano. And I like to say she tortured 2-3 generations worth of young people, starting with my father and moving right into me. So this was an expected thing to do in my house.
Did you like practicing as a young boy?
No, I didn't. And I think a lot of that has to do with how I was taught. Because despite, my father had very mixed feelings about the piano because he had been forced to play. And the way he got out of it was he joined the Navy at the age of 17 to escape his mother. That's never a good thing, as far as I'm concerned, to have to turn to the military to avoid piano and dance lessons. And it just happened to be 1942. There was a war going on. So, his timing was not great as far as that goes.
Well, you've said that your father played jazz piano.
He played everything. He was talented enough that, he had to play the classics, as we all called them. But he grew up during that wonderful period of American popular song that saw the creation of the so-called American Songbook, the theater and movie music of people like Gershwin and Jerome Kern and Richard Rodgers and Irving Berlin. And these are all New York Jews, as he was. And so it was kind of his music, his generation's music. And just like I was a Stones fan and a Beatles fan, so he was a Gershwin fan.
I remember I read Joseph Hofmann's, I think it was The Art of Playing the Piano. He had perfect pitch. Did your grandmother, does your father, do you have perfect pitch? Is it a family thing?
No, and it's funny you mentioned that book, because I have a copy that's autographed by Joseph Hofmann that I gave my grandmother. It's a neat little book.
Yeah.
It's a neat little book.
In the interview that you had with Larry King, which is really a wonderful interview, he whipped out a profound line, which was, Bach is generally regarded as the first jazz musician, which you said, I wouldn't argue with that at all, which I enjoyed. Could you elaborate on the spirit of that statement?
Sure, I would be happy to. What I got out of what Larry King was saying, and it was a wonderful interview, by the way, is that, first of all, in the music of the Baroque, especially the instrumental music, the high Baroque, the instrumental forms are based on dance music, almost entirely. And that means you tend to have instrumental genres in which the beat is very clear, very steady, and that much of the music is about manipulating that beat. Second of all, there's a huge emphasis on improvisation in the age of Bach. Any competent musician was expected to be able to sit down at a keyboard, in this case a harpsichord or a clavichord or an organ, and improvise based on the harmonic structure of whatever piece you're dealing with. If it's a chorale, so the harmonic structure of the chorale. This is so much, but this is what a jazz player does. The only big difference might be this concept of swing, and that is the polyrhythms that are native to African music force a jazz player to be playing on 2 or 3 different rhythmic levels at once. And polyrhythm is not part of the music of the high Baroque. But improvising on harmonies, going with a very steady beat, being able to create based on harmonic materials, melodic materials out of your head, this is something every musician was expected to do at the time. And Bach did better than anybody.
There's also a time you mentioned you worked professionally as a jazz pianist. Is that where does that fall on the timeline of your chronology?
From the time I was about 18 to the time I was about 25. From the time I went away to college, I made about half of my money by playing in clubs and bars, and I got involved in New York when I was in my early 20s. I was working with a wonderful saxophone player named Lee Konitz, and I could have gone that way, but it's a horrible life, as I discovered. Yeah. I mean, it's a really horrible life. And I imagine you had the same experience a generation after, or 2 generations after I did. I'm talking about the early 1970s now. But it was gooey and awful, and you weren't making much money, and these restaurant and bar owners are ripping you off, and you join the union, and then the union rips you off, and it's just yucky.
Dr. Greenberg, was it Bizet who said, music, what a beautiful art, but what a wretched career, or something like that?
Yeah, don't you know it? Exactly. And, and I didn't want to prove my parents right. Of course, my parents reacted to my musical aspirations the way most parents do, and that is, you could be a doctor, you could be a lawyer. And then I said, why have you been giving me piano lessons for all these years? why are you surprised I'm going to major in music at a university?
Well, how did you learn jazz? I mean, how did you learn to improvise? Did you have a mentor at that time? Was it your dad, or did you have a teacher?
No, I didn't, and I wish I had. But, it's an oral tradition, and I learned by listening to records, to tell you the truth.
Which records?
I did, the first jazz pianist I fell in love with was Errol Garner, and in particular his Concert by the Sea album that was made, I think, in about 1956. And it's just the most spectacular piano playing. And I just fell in love. I memorized every note on the album. I could still sing every note on the album. And then you start imitating as best you can. And then I fell in love with Dave Brubeck, not so much for his piano playing, but for his composing. Then it was Oscar Peterson, then Phineas Newborn, and then from there, everybody else, Bill Evans and Chick Corea. Dave McKenna is a favorite of mine.
Yeah, very underrated player, Dave McKenna.
Oh, my God, I think he's just at the very top.
Yeah.
If you were in Boston, as you were, that was his home turf, and people still talk about him with awe in Boston.
Well, for people who don't know, Dave McKenna he could walk a very tasteful left-hand bass line and comp and solo all at the same time. It was ridiculous.
Yeah, he called it the three-handed technique. He would comp his chords with the thumb and forefinger of both hands, and then solo with the upper three fingers of his right hand.
That three-hand reminded me of Thalberg.
Yeah, Thalberg had all kinds. They all would kind of create their own little technique that someone else couldn't do. And I think what you're talking about with Thalberg, if I recall, he had some kind of way of playing chords that only he could play, some kind of super rapid six. Who I was thinking about just now was Clementi. I'm 2 generations off. Clementi specialized in playing these incredibly rapid thirds and sixths. And so when he competed with Mozart at a very famous competition in early 1782, that's what he did. He just sat down and started doing all this rapid stuff, and Mozart just sat there apparently looking at the ceiling thinking, this is not music at all, this is just gymnastics. And then Mozart sat down and played all the same thirds and sixths, but incorporated them into a piece of music, at which time everyone said, okay, Mr. Clementi, and Clementi stood up and shook Mozart's hands, and, I am not worthy, and that was the end of that. But yeah, this is what the piano was a contact sport. Playing music was a contact sport. You used to have these what are called in jazz cutting contests. You'd see who could play faster and better, and slowly you'd winnow out the field, and it was like an athletic event. And certainly that's not true anymore.
Dr. Greenberg, for the piano battles back in the day, were there like 3 rounds or something, and that didn't include sight reading and improvisation and something like that?
Depending, and to my knowledge, the toughest thing, the key was always whomever was on stage would ask someone in the audience to give them a theme. And then both pianists would have to improvise on that theme that they'd never heard until that moment. And Beethoven, for example, was famous for doing that so well that he would always insist on going first, because more often than not, the other pianist would sneak out the door while Beethoven was playing, so that when it was the other pianist's turn, they discovered that pianist was no longer in the house. So yeah, there was all kinds of stuff that was involved in this kind of thing. When Mozart was a kid, they'd put a sheet over the keys, and if you're not a piano player, that sounds very complicated. But of course, as we all know, you don't have to be seeing the keys to play. But for other folks, it seemed like magic that he would still be able to play the piano or the harpsichord, as the case was. A
lot of people, when they think of composers, they have a very idealized image of them. So for them, Mozart, Beethoven, they're almost deities, gods in a way. Let's talk about Salieri and Mozart. And I think it was so funny in a podcast, you referred to Amadeus, the movie, as that movie. And I thought that was great. Salieri has been really unfairly treated in history, and maybe that movie contributed to that, right? But he taught Beethoven.
He taught Beethoven. He taught Liszt. He was Schubert's principal teacher, all the way through Schubert's college years. He supervised Schubert's music education for like 15 years.
Wow.
He was not just an important composer, but also, as you just said, a very important teacher. Yeah, he taught Beethoven. He gave Beethoven vocal writing lessons. And poor Salieri. It all started in, I think, about 1820. Well, it started when he went crazy at the end of his life and tried to kill himself, and he claimed that he had killed Mozart. But in his moments of lucidity, because he was mentally ill, he said, "Of course I didn't do that. I'm going mad. I'm just going mad." But the big problem was in the late 1820s. Alexander Pushkin, the great Russian writer, sat down and wrote a one-act play called Mozart and Salieri, where he speculated that Salieri killed Mozart because Mozart was an idiot who could do this one thing, and Salieri, who had dedicated his life to music and to God, felt that he was just a mediocrity and that God had cursed him, and the curse was this Mozart. But it was just a metaphorical play. Mozart isn't even a person in the Pushkin play. He's just the one thing we all fear the most, and that is that someone is going to prove us to be frauds. It's going to prove us to be that untalented, uneducated, unintelligent person we all fear we might be. And so Mozart is just a cardboard character in the Salieri, and rather in the Pushkin. But then Rimsky-Korsakov turned that into an opera, and really started fleshing out the story. And then Peter Schaffer wrote a Broadway play, and the original name of the Broadway play was Salieri, because again, it's about Salieri. It's not about Mozart, but he changed it and called it Amadeus. Then he fleshed it out, and then he wrote the script for the movie. And then Milos Forman, the director, had to further flesh out the character of Mozart. So by the time you get to the movie, you have the untruth of the story, but projected in such a way that it seems like it might be possible. So that's why I call it that movie. I have to say, I'm asked crazy questions. And I'm out there a lot, Nikhil, and people ask me questions. And among the questions I'm asked, one of the most common questions I'm asked, although not so much anymore, but certainly 20 years ago, every day, is Amadeus accurate? Is that movie accurate? And then, of course, you have to say, no, it's great entertainment, but it's crappy history. And people would be so disappointed. I say, what do you think's going to happen when they make a Hollywood movie? Excuse me.
Once you, I would say, Disneyfy a person, Mozart becomes this, like a cartoon character. But there's a quote in a letter where he said that, I've worked really hard, I've studied everyone, and, this didn't come so easy to me. It appears that way, but I really worked hard at this.
Yes, he did. He worked like a dog. He was a genius, but I hate using that word because when you say someone's a genius, now they're not even human anymore. Now there's something else. There's something above and beyond us. Mozart, bless him, had the best music education any person ever had. His dad might have been a first-class jerk, but he gave his son the best music education anyone has ever had. He took him all over Europe and introduced him to everybody. Second of all, he helped his son write the music. I mean, a lot of early music that Mozart gets credit for really was written by Leopold Mozart, or the bulk of it was done by Leopold Mozart. Maybe Wolfgang created a theme here and there. But the point is, from the very beginning, he was being coached. I mean, from the age of 3, he was up and out. So he had a great music education. He was incredibly ambitious. He worked very hard. He knew his worth in an era that did not value the work of artisans, but he knew that his talent ennobled him. He didn't allow that talent to be squashed by the Archbishop of Salzburg or his father. He took it to Vienna, and God bless him. If a couple of things had gone different for him, he probably would have lived a long time.
What was different about the music education back then versus today? I mean, today we have lovely performers who are technically excellent, but was there something different about, I mean, I've read from my interviews with classical improvisers, they say, you have to study figured bass at a high level, you have to understand theory. What was different about Mozart's education, Haydn's education, Bach's education when they were learning music?
That's all they did. They were tracked. There was no public school curriculum for them to attend. It's funny, Haydn is the exception here, but let's talk about Mozart and Bach. They both went into their father's profession. They did what children did back then, children of the working class. If your father was a tradesman, if your father was a butcher, you became a butcher. If your father was a metal worker, you became a metal worker. In the case of Bach and Mozart, their families. I mean, there were something like 80 professional musicians in the Bach family tree between the 1500s and the 1800s. Same thing with Mozart to the degree that this is what his father did. So it's not like they went to public school. It's not like they did anything else. They were tracked. And so if you have a tremendous talent, like these Romanian gymnasts from the 1970s, who were tracked from the age of 3, and that's all they did growing up, then they develop a spectacular level of technique that no one else could achieve because their whole life is dedicated to it. It doesn't necessarily create a rounded human being, and someone like that could not compete in today's economic market. You have to know more than one thing in our world today. But it was a very different world, and very different things were expected from members of the working class. They weren't expected to be rounded. They weren't expected to be educated. They were expected to be able to apply their trade. And so that's what they were taught to do.
How did classical improvisation fade away at the turn of the 20th and I guess the end of the 19th century?
It's a good question. And I don't think I know any better than anybody else. I suspect that the virtuosity of the 19th century, the emphasis on performing in ever larger spaces and people expecting to hear different things. I think the middle class using music increasingly as entertainment and rather than as an ongoing and intellectual pursuit made folks expect things to be played a certain way continuously. Certainly, the advent of recording and the advent of records pushed that even further. You're used to hearing things played a certain way, and that's how you want to hear them played. But I still don't understand. It's so much fun to improvise. I still don't quite understand why such spectacular pianists, because concert pianists, let's face it, these are amazing athletes, amazing musicians, why they're willing not to improvise, why they don't want to have that as part of their lives. So I could posit to you the changing economics of the music business, the advent of recordings, and the expectation that things will be played a single way. But I still can't quite figure out why musicians stopped improvising.
Now, I want to switch over to the great courses, which is what you're popularly known for. And I was just thinking to myself, my goodness, if I had not spent money on music history in college, which is thousands of dollars, and I had just bought your course, I would have saved so much money and I would have learned so much more.
Right.
Now, I think it works because, for one reason, you're a composer, so you understand. So you're not just... So musicologists approach the great composers differently from a composer. Let's talk about your compositional training. You studied under Edward Cohn, Daniel Wirtz, Carlton Gamer. Could you talk about your development as a composer during your undergraduate years and the influence of your teachers?
When I look back at my teachers in college, I am amazed that I got anything, and that wasn't their fault, it was my fault. I came up through a big public school in New Jersey, in southern New Jersey. For people who don't know anything about southern New Jersey, just think about the ugliest place in the world. Think about the one place you never want to have to go. You have just imagined where I grew up. And, despite my grandmother and despite the emphasis on piano in my family, I had virtually no training when it came to music theory, when it came to really knowing the repertoire. I knew piano, but I didn't know the symphonic repertoire. I didn't know the chamber repertoire. I didn't know squat. And so I went away to college, and now you've got all these amazing brainiacs, these fantastic composers, Milton Babbitt, J.K. Randall, Claudio Spies, then the people you mentioned, Colin Gamer and Dan Wirtz. And, I couldn't have even framed a question for my first 2 years there that they could have answered. I didn't know enough to even know what questions to ask. So what I learned initially from these people was a certain degree of artistic integrity. That is, whatever you do when you put pencil to paper, and in those days it was pencil to paper. When you put pencil to paper, you have to decide what you want to write before you write it, and you have to care about every pitch, and you have to care about every rhythm. You have to listen to yourself, and you have to be willing to be critical and rewrite. The gods of that music department, aside from Milton Babbitt, who was our local deity, the gods were the dead Germans. The dead Germans, you're talking about Bach and Haydn and Mozart. I know they were Austrian, but they were German-speaking. And Beethoven, and especially Brahms. And what made them the deities is that there was never a wasted note. Nothing ever done purely for affect. Everything should be explicable in terms of its theory, and it should sound good, which means rewrite, and rewrite. That's what I got. I didn't get anything specific because I didn't know enough to ask the right questions, but I got a sense of inherent professionalism. And, as it turns out, that worked, because by the time I was a junior, I was designated a university scholar, which allowed me to design the rest of my program myself. And it was heavy on composition, and that's really, by the time I was a junior, I started to speak the language. And by the time I graduated, I was speaking the language. And then before going off to grad school, I taught high school for a couple of years and continued taking lessons with faculty. So that, I was a late bloomer.
In that period, what was the trend in musical academia? From a previous interview I had, there was a trend towards, I guess, serialism and dissonance. Was that part of your training?
It was not. It was never part of my training per se, and thank goodness. All of the composers I just named, with the exception of Edward Cohn, were all ultra-serialists, which meant that virtually every aspect of their music was preconceived via various formula. Milton Babbitt somehow made it work into music. I don't know how he did it. Somehow Babbitt's music still sounds like music. But really, the whole serialist thing was as antithetical to creating music that communicates anything but the formula. But they didn't try to teach you that because you were too young. I mean, teaching an undergraduate how to write serial music is like sex education for a 4-year-old. It's simply not appropriate. They don't have the tools to even start to comprehend what it's all about. And generally speaking, and I think this is true, even at the graduate level, those people who were still serialists by the time I got to grad school would not teach it, because there was the feeling that you must make these decisions for yourself. You have to hear the voice in your head. You have to be drawn to whatever music you're drawn to, and then having decided this is the kind of music you want to write, then you might work with somebody who's sympathetic. But correctly so, this stuff generally is not taught because it becomes almost bad propaganda. You start indoctrinating students, and that's not a good idea. No one wants to be in that position. So luckily, I never had an indoctrinaire as a teacher, and there was never any demand that you learn this stuff. There's a very famous line from Arnold Schoenberg, and everyone who is a serialist knew it and understood it, and that is, there's still a lot of great pieces to be written in C major. And it's an important thing to remember. We choose our language for ourselves. We cannot force a musical language on anybody. And by the time I was a mature composer, the serialism... And
when was that? When would you have considered yourself a mature composer?
By about 1982. So I would have been about 28 years old. The music I was writing about then is still music that I am not embarrassed to show to somebody.
Wow. But you've been composing your whole life, right? Pretty much?
My whole life, yeah.
What kind of compositions were you doing before your undergraduate? Was it contemporary styles?
No, it was all jazz stuff. all jazz stuff.
What did your teachers think of that when you went into Princeton?
They didn't. I never showed it to them. I just didn't show it to them.
Did you see any parallels in your training at Princeton with what you had organically done for yourself?
Again, I didn't know enough. I can't answer that because the work I did as an undergraduate was the kind of grunt work all undergraduates have to do. Species, counterpoint, harmony, canon, fugue. You go through the Percy Gurchas is what I did, the Percy Gurchas books on musical form, which were written in the early 20th century and are still very excellent. You know, you learn how to write a theme and variations form movement. Then you learn how to write a minuet and trio. Then you learn how to write a scherzo. You learn how to write a rondo. Then you learn how to write sonata form. So really, this was not free composition. It was learning. It was learning technique, learning how to push notes around, learning how to balance harmony and melody, which is, of course, the key in Western music and what makes Western music so different from most other world music traditions, is that you have this constant conflict and simpatico between these simultaneities, the science of harmony, and between linearities, the existence of melody, and then trying to balance them through this use of counterpoint or polyphony. And, you know, it's hard to learn how to do that and then to come up with a language of your own. It takes a long time. So I have to say, as an undergraduate, I wasn't grappling with any of these big issues. It was just trying to gain some mastery of the syntax. And that's, I think, what undergraduate years are about for a lot of people, unless you started young and were trained young. But as I said before, I didn't have any training going in.
So you went to the University of California, Berkeley, and there you earned your PhD in music composition. Your principal teachers were Andrew Imbrie and Ollie Wilson. Could you talk about your experience there and working with those teachers, and what did you get out of that experience?
Well, it's an entirely different experience, you know, night and day between undergraduate and graduate. As I said before, I took 2 years off, which I think, by the way, is the smartest thing I ever did in my whole life, was not go right away to grad school out of undergrad, but instead dealt with the world, got to be a better piano player, kept my lessons going, and then when I went to grad school, I did it because I wanted to and not kind of as some knee-jerk reaction because this is what I got to do next. By the time I got to grad school, I knew kind of what I was doing, and I was able to write real music. I was able to write real music from the time I arrived. And the way composition is taught at that level is that, you're in your pro seminar with 2 or 3 other composers and as one of your classes, and you just write. You decide what you're going to write. The first thing I wrote when I got there was a fantasy variations for chamber orchestra. And you finish it as quickly as you can. You know, in this case, that piece took me about 4 months. Every week you go in to the pro seminar and the students play what they've written that week and you discuss it with the professor. If you got a good composition teacher, which I had in Ollie Wilson and Andy Imbrie, then you have people who can divine what they think you're looking for and can help you find it. If you have a crappy composition teacher, which I did at UC, someone who I'm not going to name now because he's still alive, God bless him, these people crap with your brain and mess with you and make you feel like you're an idiot.
Well, specifically, what were you working on musically? How did they shape your compositions? And could you give an example of the commentary they would give on your work?
They didn't shape it. What they would do, and this is what a great composition teacher has to be able to do. The teacher has to be able to divine what he or she thinks you want, what he or she thinks you're after, and has to be able to coach you and say, now, have you thought about this? Or maybe Andy Imbrie was someone who would get down and dirty with you. He'd say, listen, this is a lovely theme, but the second phrase is too short. This is truncated. And he'd improvise something at the piano and say, are you hearing what I'm hearing here? We need a little more time for these ideas to develop before we can go on. So that would be a very specific thing to address. Other things would be, listen, what's the dialogue you're creating here? Is this a piece of music in which there's an ongoing variational process? Are you interested in contrast? And if you are going to introduce a contrast, what sort of contrast do you want? What kind of story are you telling? How high a drama level do you want to create? Then from a purely practical point of view, I still remember going into a lesson with Ollie once, and I had the beginnings of a piece of music. It was a trio. And I'd written mezzo piano in the first measure. He says, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means mezzo piano." He says, "What do you mean it means mezzo piano?" He said, "I know it means mezzo piano. What do you think the player's going to play?" I said, "Mezzo piano." He says, "No, the player's not going to play mezzo piano. The player's either going to play piano or forte, because mezzo piano doesn't mean anything. It means middle piano. It's an entirely relative term."
Yep.
I said, "All dynamics are relative," because, but some are more relative than others. He says, "If you don't declare what you want, the player will play what he or she wants, and it will inevitably be not what you want." So there's a very good lesson. Another lesson I had once is I wrote an orchestra piece, and I still remember in the viola parts at one point, it was 8 or 10 measures of a sustained pitch. And I don't remember which one of my teachers it was, but the teacher just said, "You better do something with that." And I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "If you ask a string player to play a note for, 16, 20 beats, and you don't change the dynamic, you don't put in a crescendo or decrescendo, you don't do something with it, they will. You cannot have that many naked notes." And so this is just good practical education, teaching you how to make sure you let the clarinetist breathe, how to make sure a singer can be prepared for the next pitch if it's a difficult pitch to find. You learn the brass tacks. But the best teachers are the ones, just the way a conductor can divine how she wants a piece of music to go, a good composition teacher can divine what his or her student is thinking about, and then helps lead that student where the student needs to go, and can be a cheerleader when necessary, and can be a critic when necessary, but always a benevolent one. I really believe in that. I believe in nurturing students, and the best teachers are good nurturers.
The study of music, in Bach's time to Mozart's time to Beethoven to Chopin, I've noticed that everyone once in a while has released a treatise on harmony. Tchaikovsky had some notes on harmony, Paul Hindemith, Walter Piston. But if you looked at a book of harmony back in, say, Mozart's time, does music improve linearly? Is all of that stuff still valid, or are things like, do we look back at stuff, they just got that wrong, or is it all still relevant today?
I see the development of music, the music language, two different ways. Expressively, we are no better off now than we were 800 years ago. We're human beings. Our arts, our societies are cyclical, but our technology improves. And to the degree that there's improvement in music, the language has become more complex. There's more syntax available today. We're not better than Mozart, God knows, but we have more syntax to draw on. And that's because it's cumulative. You can't avoid it. As soon as someone adds something new to the language, you have more words, more vocabulary in the language. So the grammar has developed. And I think that's what you're talking about, let's say the grammar of harmony as it existed in Mozart's time. And by the way, as far as I'm concerned, harmony books are nothing but cookbooks. They're just recipes. And all they do is identify what happens when you put this, and this together. Ultimately, it's in the ear of a composer to render this into real music.
What's the best way to learn harmony, Dr. Greenberg?
Listen to a lot of music and then sit down blank. The same way we learn how to play jazz, we listen to music. You read scores, and then you sit down in front of your own blank page, and either you hear it or you don't. It's terrifically hard, isn't it? I mean, how am I supposed to know this stuff? You have to know it. One good way to do it, when I used to teach composition, especially to undergraduates who need to be rooted, is you take a Chopin prelude, you take a Bach chorale, and I'm talking, these are very varied kinds of pieces, but you take a short piece written by someone who really knew what he was doing, and you tell them, all right, put as many measures on your music paper I want you to write a piece of music that does the same thing harmonically, but something completely different thematically. You imitate. You imitate. I mean, that's the only way to learn is through imitation. And that's how we build the edifice of our own knowledge based on the music of the past. And then, having done that enough over enough years, having filled up enough notebooks with all this crap, then you just start on your own blank page. But without imitation, no progress can be made. And I think, and now I'm going to get a little lectury, not to you, but just in general.
No, do it.
Well, I think some of the damage we've done to ourselves as artists in the 20th century and then here in the 21st is that we think we should create everything from scratch all the time. You know, part of the breakdown of the tonal system in the early 20th century was that expression is not just contextual. The musical language itself is contextual. We can do whatever we want, whenever we want. Part of the problem with that breakdown is we don't study the past the way we should because we think we've been cut off from the past. We should be creating our own languages. I have heard more musical charlatanism in new music concerts in my lifetime than I think anyone has ever heard. I mean, students call themselves composers now. They can't put together, but they say, oh, but this is expressive of blah, blah, blah. Their program notes are magnificent examples of validation, and the music is not music. They don't know what they're doing.
Now, that's a great segue. So there's a wonderful interview with you and William Shatner, and he asks you a very valid question. He says, I'm afraid to say that I don't like this piece because somebody will say that I don't know anything. Or most people, when they listen to Mozart or Bach, they say, that's music. I can get it. I understand it. But when you get into the 20th century, it's a lot more difficult for many people because they hear sudden blasts of timbre, sudden squeaky noises, and they say, wait a second, what's going on here? They don't want to appear uneducated in music. So how do you assuage people to be critical and also, you know, to kind of go with their gut feeling sometimes if something doesn't agree with them?
Well, that's a great question but it's of course two different questions. First of all, we understand Mozart because Mozart speaking a language that was firmly established 200 years before he was born and kept being spoken by almost everybody for another 150 years after he died, or another 130 years after he died. The tonal language was like the English language, a language that we all spoke. Yes, as we go through time, vocabulary changes and idioms might change, but, you know, Bach could still understand a piece of music as music that had been written by Brahms 200 years later. But all bets are off now. All bets are off because if you're creating your own language, it could be a Tower of Babel situation where everyone could be speaking quite beautifully to him or herself, but no one else can understand you. And this is a huge challenge in the musical arts today in composition. Now, I'd like to think, for example, in my music, that a compelling rhythmic surface and enough good pitch information will kind of drag my listener through. But what Shatner was talking about, as you've just expressed it, is absolutely legitimate. And but here's the other side of it. I don't know if you're a drinker.
Not really.
Okay, sadly, at my age, I've become one. Well, because there's just certain pleasures that are unavoidable in life if you want to.
It's healthy in moderation. That's what they say.
Yeah, exactly. But my point is, if you give a 16-year-old kid a really great bourbon or single malt scotch, they'll spit it out and blah, blah, blah. And you know what? They're right. They're right. It is poison, and given that they don't know anything about it and that they're young and they can't contextualize these tastes, all you taste is the yucky. But over time and context, and you learn what a pleasure this can be and the nuances of difference. And that's part of the problem of reacting too quickly to something you think you don't like, because you just don't like it now because you don't know anything about it. And so much 20th century music and 21st century music is wonderful. I mean, just so life-enhancing and so fantastic.
Well, your music, Dr. Greenberg, you are a great composer, and I mean,
Thank you.
I was researching for this interview. I said I got to listen to his work now. I'll never mind the great work that you've done with the great courses. There was one piece that I was listening to. I think it's Invasive Species. And I was like, this is great. I mean, this is great. If I could tie that back to the great courses, it works because, you're a composer. And one thing that I want to segue to is you don't mind taking shots at the weaker moments of composers. And I'll always remember this. There was a time you were talking about Tchaikovsky, and I think you were talking about the 1812 overture, and you said...
Oh, that transition.
And you said,
that transition.
You said, and I love this because, for one, it allows me to understand that, they can... Not everything is Disney. Not everything is perfect. You could actually have weaker sections in music. And you took him to task, and I like that. And I think it's only due to the fact that you're a composer that you would understand where things are effective and where things are not.
I happen to agree with that, and of course, my musicologist friends will they'll shoot rubber bands at me because that's what they do. It's the most damage they can do. But when I look at a piece of music, I'm always thinking, why these pitches? Why these rhythms? Why these choices? Because that's what a piece of music is. It's a series of sonic choices that are made in order to tell a story. I mean, when an author looks at another author's work, the author is thinking the same thing. Why are you telling this story here? Why this character? Why did you choose this situation? Because these are the questions you ask, ultimately, to A, understand what's being done, and B, figure out if there's anything worth stealing for your own work. Because it's all petty larceny all the time, and we're always on the lookout for something to slip in our pocket and take home with us and use. Everyone takes from everybody. I mean, it's the oldest line in the book, and that is it talent borrows and genius steals. That's what you have to do. You asked me before what you do. I said you take a Bach chorale or a Chopin prelude, and you write one of your own using that composer's harmonic progression. That's how you do it. You incorporate what's been done, and you get enough vocabulary until you can start doing your own. I have to say, I'm very happy when I hate prodigies, by the way. I don't believe in prodigies. I understand that prodigies can be performers. But guess what? As far as I'm concerned, there's never been a 16-year-old novelist who wrote a great novel. And for all of the talk about these little children who write operas and these little children who do this and that, it's all entirely derivative. They're simply using someone else's language, someone else's stuff, and figuring out a way to blend it together into some kind of musical smoothie that they can then pour in a glass and claim as theirs. And I think that's fine. That's how we learn. But I think that the public overreacts to these children who can do things like that, because real creative work doesn't happen until you've mastered yourself. And we don't master ourselves until we have at least gotten enough life experience to get through puberty, and preferably a little longer.
I just want to end off with a couple of really fun, fast questions, and let's just do like rapid fire. So let's really do this. So name your top 3 pianists.
Oh, you're asking hard questions. 3, just 3. Maurizio Pollini, Martha Argerich, and I love them all, dude. All right, Maurizio Pollini, Martha Argerich, and Garrick Olson.
Top 3 jazz pianists.
In no particular order: Dave McKenna, Chick Corea, Oscar Peterson.
Okay, top 3 20th century composers.
Stravinsky, Schoenberg, Bartók.
Top 3 romantic composers.
Mahler, Tchaikovsky. Oh, there's so many to choose from. Schumann.
Okay.
No, stop. Hold the presses. Mahler, Brahms, Tchaikovsky.
What's your favorite instrument to write for?
Piano.
Favorite orchestral timbre instrument?
Don't have one. Virtually impossible. Impossible to say.
Favorite format to write for?
Chamber music.
Any particular organization?
This is where I am right now, where my head is right now. But I'm really enjoying writing pieces for piano and some combination. So whether it's a piano quintet like Invasive Species, which you just heard, a piano trio, which I just finished and will be premiered in April. I really enjoy writing for strings or winds and piano.
If you could get any composer, alive or dead, right now in a room and just have coffee or a drink with that composer and talk about music, and you could ask them questions for an hour, who would that composer be?
Mozart.
And what would you ask him?
I'd ask him, first of all, how do you want your martini? You want it dry? You want it wet? You want it dirty? Do you want olives? Do you want a twist? He would be the happiest person in the world. I would say, how would you like to try and play a big piano? Because I have a Steinway D in my studio.
Yep.
The guy was a great raconteur. He told a wonderful joke. He, of course, would sit down and play for as long as you wanted him to. His English was impeccable. He spent a lot of his childhood in London and was excellent with languages. So I would just hang. I would just hang with him, and I just let him talk. I just think being around someone like that, you don't even have to talk about music. Just the way he perceives the world, the way he would address. I would love to see the way he would address the keyboard.
Yeah.
What his hands would look like when he put them on the keys. Anything. I don't think you need to talk about music with anybody to get an amazing musical education from them, because music's an extension of the person. So I would just love to be with Mozart.
Okay, for people interested in your music, Dr. Greenberg, can you recommend 3 works for them to start with?
Well, the works that I would recommend are the ones that could be seen on YouTube, of course. So there's a piece called, as you said, there's Invasive Species. Let me see. There's a piece called... what is that called? I forgot the name of it entirely. Oh, you see, you put me on the spot, and I've got to remember. There's a piece called Funny Like a Monkey, which is a piano quartet. There's a piece called Lemurs Are Afraid of Fusas for cello and piano that I was really happy with.
And I think let's end off with this final question. You told Larry King, you said music of the last 250 years is frankly contemporary music. Can you elaborate on that sentence?
My dad, God bless him, just passed away last year. He was 92 years old. So 3 of my father's lifetimes back to back. Someone's born, they die, born, die, born, my dad, okay? So 3 times 92 is 276 years. That's 3 consecutive human lifetimes. 276 years ago, it was 1743. In 1743, Johann Sebastian Bach was hard at work in Leipzig writing his Goldberg variations. He, at that time, would have been 58 years old. In 1743, Haydn was 11 years old. George Washington was 11 years old and presumably chopping down cherry trees. In 1743, Mozart is not going to be born for another 13 years. And in 1743, Beethoven's mother, Anna Magdalena Keverich, had not been born yet. 3 lifetimes ago. And it encompasses virtually the entire repertoire as we understand it. This is all contemporary. This is all stuff that happened yesterday, not just by geologic standards, but even by human standards. And the people of those days were just like us. So this tendency in our world today to think we've cornered the market on change and on contemporary, we're foolish. We're foolish. We're throwing out the cultural and spiritual bathwater of our culture by being arrogant and chauvinistic. And we really do need to accept that this extraordinary music belongs to all of us and is relevant to us here.
And I would say, if you want an introduction to this contemporary music, please go and check out Dr. Greenberg's The Great Courses, all his lectures. I mean, that's what you give. I mean, if you have kids, I would say, before you force them to take piano lessons, buy this and let them have a good time and enjoy it, because there's no stress. You get to enjoy all the great music, and really the analysis is spot on. It's insightful. It's from a real composer who's telling you about other composers. He can explain the music to you that's in an accessible way. And it's also very high level too. So it goes, anybody who's a beginner can understand it, and even someone who's advanced will get plenty out of it, and it'll cost you way less than spending thousands in a college. I mean, I've learned that lesson. So
I have to say, Nikhil, the highest compliment I can be paid is when a fellow musician says, I got a lot out of this. And the best mail I get, and I do get mail, I get mail from conductors and from musicians. I mean, it's David Finkel, the cellist who played in the in the Emerson Quartet for 1 million years. We became friends because he loved my courses. So, that's the most gratifying thing of all, when fellow pros say, I can get something out of this.
By the way, Dr. Greenberg, is there a project you want to plug for 2019 that you've been recording or anything?
Well, I would like to plug a couple of things, if I might.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would love you to let everyone know that all of my courses are for sale for download from my website. I've partnered with the Great Courses, so I'm a selling agent of all my own courses. And on my website, you can get a lot of information about them. You can sample them. And if you buy them from me, you get all of the written materials as well. If you buy them from Amazon, you do not. And I would also mention to you that I'm now blogging and reviewing and vlogging 2 to 3 days a week on a platform called Patreon. It's a subscription platform, so, you have to sign up for a couple of bucks a month. But this is where I'm putting a lot of my energies right now. And I would say I'm posting between 3,000 and 5,000 words a week. And I'd like to make that more of my future. So it's worth checking out. I think my address it's patreon.com/Robert Greenberg Music. And I would ask you to check it out.
Well, the great Dr. Robert Greenberg, everybody, check out his Patreon and check out his work on the Great Courses and his original music. I highly recommend it. Dr. Greenberg, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Nikhil.